Hello everyone, Alexa Donne here, and today we are going to be having a much requested, much put off by me discussion of YA crossover. This is a big buzzword that gets thrown around and has come up more and more often as well. More YA crossover books have been published, and all of us out there have gotten a little bit confused about, well, what does this mean for YA? Is my book YA? Is it crossover? If so, what do I do with that? Are crossover books good for YA? Bad for YA? I do have opinions, and in fact, because this is kind of a big amorphous topic, it's honestly constantly changing. Every publishing season with new books being published and the various ways that they're received, things are changing, so I don't consider this a definitive discussion, but the best that I could put together in this time, and mostly I'm going to focus on kind of what you can do if you think you have a crossover on your hands, as well as a few of my saltier opinions. So what is crossover fiction? At the heart of it, a crossover is literally where something exists firmly in one space, whether that's a category or a genre, but it crosses over to another audience. So in the case of YA, this means a YA book that crosses over to adult readers, or really readers of adult. I actually hesitate to say adult readers, it slipped through there because so many adults do read YA, but it's more readers of adult fiction might pick up that YA crossover book where they might not otherwise pick up any YA. The crossover potential is that ability to step across genres and reach new audiences. What makes YA crossover so tricky to talk about is that generally YA as a category, because it is a marketing category, has evolved a lot over the last 15 years. And you have to understand it is a marketing category. The whole idea of a crossover is a marketing idea. Audience, who a book is reaching and how you reach that audience. YA is a category that exists to reach an audience who liked books about teens, very vivid, immediate, coming of age, but with a lot of very specific things to YA. I have a whole video on what YA is, and I will link to that down below. And essentially what has happened that as the original and primary readership of YA books have grown up, we've seen a lot of shifts in YA as a category, because instead of essentially leaving YA behind, a very large number of those readers have stayed in YA, and thus YA has evolved. That's why 20 years ago, a book like Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants could be published as YA, was published as YA. But now I don't think a book like that would be published. It's too light. It's literally targeted to very young teens, 12, 13, 14-year-olds, and it sits in a very kind of light space. We're going to talk more about lower YA in a minute, but what kind of ushered in this shift into YA crossovers is very popular YA authors who wrote very firmly younger YA books, like Sarah J. Maas or Leigh Bardugo, though I'd say Shadow Moon fell kind of in the middle, but point is, very, very popular YA authors then wrote a new series that was a little more mature, that got a little darker, that had sex in it, in the case of Sarah J. Maas. And the publishers made a marketing decision, even though they had books that I would argue could be published as adult or should be published as adult, they weren't, because it was the smartest marketing decision to reach those popular YA authors, YA audiences, and thus we start getting crossover YA. ACOTAR, of course, coming way before Six of Crows. Six of Crows was a decision that was made later because multiple books had done this successfully. I know it doesn't seem that long ago, but depending on how long you've been in the YA world, you might remember the time when you literally could not get a book set in college published. It was a no man's land. I mean, there was a whole thing with New Adult that happened, and I have a video where I talk about New Adult and I discuss part of my theory that some of what people wanted for New Adult just kind of got merged into YA crossover. And it did. The first major example I could think of a YA crossover book with a character set in college was Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell, another very good example of an already wildly successful YA author who wrote a book that could have edged into adult, and Rainbow Rowell had in the past, before Eleanor and Park, written adult novels published as YA to appeal to that audience. So we see the rise of this kind of book because they do very well. And it did open the door for authors who weren't established and famous to do similar things. We've seen more college set YA such as American Panda or Emergency Contact. And in the fantasy space, some examples I came up with of earlier YA crossover, or like, the thing is YA crossover hasn't really been a thing for that long. So one of these books was published in 2018, but I'm thinking of books like Winter Song and Furyborn. It's cases where the books still feel like YA. There's an immediacy to them. The characters are teen or on the cusp of adulthood, but they have slight adult trappings, fantasy in those two cases. They can appeal to adult fantasy readers because they kind of build off some of the traditions of adult fantasy, but because they still are written by YA writers and feel YA, that's why they fell into the crossover space, but we're able to take some, chances on slightly more sexual content in the cases of both of those books, which of course Sarah J Maas opened the door on. I do have feelings about that. I have feelings about all of this. I also want to talk about opposite crossovers. These also end up really confusing people. So these are examples where adult authors who have primarily written adult novels, full-on adult, fantasy or sci-fi novels, write a book that has crossover appeal in the opposite direction. They write a book and their publisher go, this could really appeal to the broader YA audience, in large part because it's full of adults. So we're going to publish it technically as adult, but do some heavy cross-marketing in YA. And it leads to some confusion where people think that those are YA novels, and then they've written a book and they're querying, and then someone like me comes along and says, that's adult fantasy, and they get very upset. And so some of the examples I'm thinking of, Uprooted by Naomi Novik and The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. They're adult fantasies in the tradition of adult fantasies that have teen protagonists that are coming of age stories. Those exist in adult sci-fi fantasy as well. Uprooted and The Bear and the Nightingale, as far as I know, with my familiarity for those authors, and definitely based on the publisher Del Rey, were intended to be adult fantasies, that they just had teen young protagonists and were cross-marketed to YA audiences. I'd like to just bring up, because I find it interesting and I am personal friends with the author, Bonds of Brass by Emily Skrutsky. Also published by Del Rey, was originally a YA novel and was rejigged to be a little more firmly adult, bought by Del Rey, and then marketed very well as a YA crossover, as an adult YA crossover, because of Emily Skrutsky's existing YA readership. That's actually a very smart example of an author who pivoted when the YA market just wasn't healthy and responsive to a good story, but she was able to pivot to adult and then land with a publisher who knew exactly what to do with crossover potential. Okay, now briefly, before I talk about what you can do as a writer about this whole crossover situation, I'm just going to talk about my feelings because you're here for a little bit of salt. I will admit that the growing trend of aggressive YA crossovers does frustrate me a little. I'm not talking about the adult ones that can be cross-marketed to YA. It's really the YA ones that are then cross-marketed to adults, or are written and published to appeal to that adult readership in YA. And I'm part of that readership. I am part of the problem. I said we would talk about lower YA. What I don't like is how crossover books and the increasingly kind of adult-leaning YA books have really pushed lower YA out of the market. I'm hopeful that we might see a slower turn with the resurgence of rom-coms, but I don't know if we're going to see another Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants published as a YA. That book would be rejigged and published as a middle grade, most likely. Upper middle grade basically had to come into being, which is almost a crossover category itself, because lower YA was just completely pushed out of the market by upper YA, which has led us into crossover territory. And to be honest, it did all start with ACOTAR. I've never really been a fan of that being published as YA, even though I completely understand why the publisher did it. But as far as I know, Sarah J Maas wrote that as an adult and considered it an adult fantasy. And what's tricky about it is now you have a situation where you can go to the shelf and let's say you're a teen reader, like not thinking about the adults. What if you're a younger teen reader? You're reading up. You could pull a YA book off the shelf that is like totally targeted to teens, or you could pull YA off the shelf that was written for 30-year-olds and has explicit sex in it. It's just very weird from a marketing standpoint because it is a marketing category, and the whole point of marketing is you're supposed to know what you're getting from something, and I'd say YA has just really edged more up into like dark, edgelord, like explicit, and I guess why not both, but my main thing is, this is the saltiest of my feelings, I suppose, is I wish more adult readers, or just really mature teen readers who have like edged up, would break out of YA more often, would go up to read adult novels, novels published for the adult market. They're not just for adults. I mean, I was reading adult novels when I was a teenager because YA didn't exist. And as part of that, I want to see the adult side of the industry evolve and change. I do think slowly they are. I love that we have books by Naomi Novik and Brandon Sanderson and Catherine Arden that occupy kind of that in-between space. I love that Leigh Bardugo got to publish Ninth House as an adult novel. Now her YA readership got confused and mad about aspects of it, but it still technically is an adult novel, and you cannot take that away from it. Chosen Ones by Veronica Roth just came out. That's on my TBR. I'm really excited to see what happens with that because it's basically an adult fantasy novel written like a YA because she is a YA author, but it's firmly an adult book. Rom-coms, adult rom-coms, have already been making this transition. There are books like The Hating Game and The Kiss Quotient, and so I think what's so interesting is the potential to see adult change, moving away from some older styles, some literary styles, and bringing the immediacy of YA, which so many readers clearly like, to firmly adult books. And with that, I would like to see the resurgence of lower YA, which is YA books that are literally written for young teens, not older teens. 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds need books to read too, and I had definitely aged out of middle grade by that age. They need somewhere to go, basically. We need more books, of all kinds of books. Okay, so moving on to the practical part. What do you do as a writer? First of all, I fully admit you're allowed to be confused. I find crossover a little bit confusing too, and it's become a thing like pornography. The rule with pornography, from a famous judgment, is you know it when you see it. The thing about crossover now is you know it when you see it, which means it's really hard to give top-line prescriptive advice that applies to everyone because I can't individually read all of your stories and tell them what they are, and agents can't either. And really, it's the agent and then the publisher who decides whether something's crossover. But how do you know which agents to query if you don't know what your book is? So first of all, my advice for you is to know where you are coming from in writing the book. Do you primarily read adult fantasy or sci-fi or romance? And that's kind of the tradition that you're coming from. And even though maybe you have a teen character, that is where you're coming from. You've probably got an adult novel with a teen character or a young character, but it is adult and you should pursue it from that angle. And then if an agent or a publisher decides it has crossover appeal, you deal with that later. On the other hand, if you are coming from a YA perspective where you read primarily YA, you set out to write a YA novel, but maybe you've nudged them up in age or situation, maybe it's set in college, you've probably got a YA core novel with crossover potential. So query it as a YA. And actually, I just gave you the magical term. I wouldn't necessarily query it as a crossover. I think that can be a little cart before horse. The magical phrase is, X is a YA fantasy novel with crossover potential. The agent is going to understand what that means, and then they can decide for themselves whether or not they agree with you. And generally the reason I advise that you kind of like firmly go in either or direction is it is still overwhelmingly established popular authors, particularly in YA, but also adult, who get to write crossovers. They get to push the envelope and kind of explore a little experiment with fiction in ways that debut authors don't as often get to do, because publishing is looking for books and authors that are easy to market, and crossovers aren't actually easy to market. So it's a little safer as a debut to really lean into the firm traditions of one category or genre rather than trying to play the middle of crossover. So the Bonds of Brass example I gave was actually excellent. Written as a YA, firmly revised to be an adult, and then left it to the publisher who bought it to market it as a crossover. Very smart strategy. That was Emily and her agent, Tao Li, basically deciding to move forward in that way, and it worked out really, really well. And then generally, we all just have to kind of keep an eye on things because things are still changing. I've seen sales in the last 6 months to a year for books that thus have not come out yet that definitely sit in a crossover space. I've seen more sales of college-y YA, and it's all about what comes out and what does well. The reason these marketing categories like YA evolve is because it's constantly like buying books, putting them out, seeing how they do, shifting acquisition strategy depending. So it is an amorphous living thing. So the conversation we might have about YA crossovers could be different in a year than it is now, but as it is right now, that's kind of where my feelings are sitting. I think it's good to essentially play it a little bit safe and be strategic in how you reach out to agents and leave it to them and the publishers to kind of make decisions about crossover marketing. All right, I'm gonna cut it off there. I mean, so many feelings. What do you think about YA crossover, about crossover fiction? What are your feelings about this, about some of the famous ones that I mentioned, feelings about it in general? Drop that down below in the comments. We'll have a fun little discussion, and give this video a thumbs up if you like it, and I will make more discussion style videos about writing and publishing. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.